She was born in silence, but her voice would thunder across kingdoms. She wore no crown, yet stood before kings. She carried no sword of her own, but led thousands into battle. This is not just the story of a saint, nor merely that of a warrior. It is the story of a girl, barely a teenager, who believed that her voice, her visions, and her courage could change the fate of a nation. Joan of Arc's name echoes through cathedrals, warfields, and courts of justice. Not because she was perfect, but because she was relentless in her faith, fierce in her purpose, and unyielding in the face of fire. She would lift a broken kingdom. She would face betrayal from her own, and she would die with dignity, only to rise again, not in body, but in legend. This is her story, told not with myth, but with memory, not through miracles, but through conviction. A tale for every soul who has ever been underestimated and yet dared to lead. Let us begin. Before she became a warrior, before her name was carved in cathedrals and burned into history, Joan of Arc was just a girl, a daughter, a shepherd, a soul growing up in silence. She was born around the year 1412 in the small village of Domremy, nestled in the countryside of northeastern France. Her world was simple: meadows and rivers, church bells and livestock. Her family was modest, hardworking, deeply faithful. They lived not in wealth, but in rhythm, with the land, the seasons, and the struggle of rural life. But the world around young Joan was anything but peaceful. France was bleeding. The 100 Years' War raged between France and England. Lands were burned, villages pillaged. Armies roamed like wolves, taking grain, taking sons, taking hope. The King of France had lost control. The English, backed by the powerful Burgundians, seized city after city. To many, it felt as if France was dying. And yet, in that dark soil, something was growing. A flame, a voice. From an early age, Joan was unlike other children. Quiet, observant, devout. She spent hours in prayer, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. A sense of purpose, though she did not yet know what. Then one day, when she was only 13, the silence broke. While standing alone in her father's garden, she heard a voice. Not imagination, not dream. A voice that filled the air and her chest with light. She fell to her knees. It was Saint Michael, she would later say. And he was not alone. Over time, she would hear more voices: Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, divine figures who spoke not in riddles but in guidance. They told her she was chosen to do what no king could, to save France. Imagine it, a girl in braided hair and homespun clothes, kneeling in the grass, being told she would lift armies, restore a broken crown, and lead soldiers as God's commander. It was impossible, and yet, she believed. For years, Joan kept this secret in her heart. She grew into a teenager with a growing fire inside her. The voices returned, clearer each time. They pressed urgency into her soul. Go, you must go. Go to the king and save France. And so she prepared. Not with a sword, but with faith. Not in pride, but in surrender. She resisted at first. I am only a girl, she said. I cannot ride. I cannot fight. But the voices persisted. It is not your strength that matters, they told her. It is your purpose. And then, one bitter winter morning, Joan turned to her uncle and said calmly, "Take me to the Dauphin. I must speak to him, for France cannot be saved unless I am allowed to act." The man looked at her in disbelief, but her eyes, those calm, blazing eyes, told him she was serious. And so the girl who could not ride, the girl who had never seen a battlefield, mounted a horse and rode toward destiny. From the fields of Domremy to the gates of history, Joan's journey had begun. She was just a peasant girl. But already, kings would soon tremble. The road from Domremy to Chinon was not just a path across France, it was a passage into legend. For Joan, it was her first true step into the unknown. She was just a teenage girl, 17, wearing men's clothing for protection, surrounded by doubt, escorted by strangers, and watched by suspicious eyes. Yet her heart was calm, her resolve unshaken. She was walking toward a crown, not to wear it, but to restore it. The journey spanned hundreds of kilometers, crossing enemy-held territory, bitter winter winds, and roads plagued with bandits and soldiers. At any moment, her mission could have ended, interrupted by a sword, a trap, or even disbelief. But the girl who had once tended sheep now commanded the trust of hardened riders. Her faith was so complete, her gaze so unwavering, that even skeptics began to follow, not just in distance, but in spirit. At night, she prayed by campfires. By day, she watched the hills, and with each passing mile, whispers grew. There is a girl, a strange girl, who says she is sent by heaven to save the king. When Joan finally reached Chinon, where the Dauphin, Charles VII, the disinherited prince, was holding court, the palace was in turmoil. France was fractured. The throne was contested. Charles himself lived in uncertainty, his legitimacy doubted, his courage tested. Into this uncertainty walked a peasant girl, asking for an audience. The court laughed, the nobles scoffed. Another mystic, they muttered, another village fool with delusions of prophecy. But word spread, and curiosity outweighed mockery. Charles, cautious but intrigued, agreed to meet her. But he wanted to test her. He switched clothes with a courtier, hiding among the crowd while placing another man on the throne. When Joan entered the grand hall, lit by torches and filled with murmurs, she paused, looked around, then, without hesitation, walked directly past the throne and knelt before the disguised prince. "My gentle Dauphin," she said, "you are the true heir of France." The court fell silent. Charles was stunned. This girl, illiterate, unknown, from no royal blood, had seen through his deception with clarity. But it wasn't just her eyes. It was the weight in her voice, the certainty in her presence. Over the following days, theologians questioned her. Nobles doubted her. She answered all with grace and conviction. She was examined by bishops, priests, even spies. Yet they found no trace of madness, no heresy, no lies. And in time, something began to shift. What if she truly had been sent? What if in a time of hopelessness, a peasant girl was the answer heaven had whispered? Charles listened, and in the end, he gave his permission. Joan of Arc, daughter of no royal house, trained in no academy, born of no prophecy, was granted command of an army. Not as a general in name, but as a banner of belief. Her mission, to liberate Orléans, a city under siege, to lift the spirit of France, to awaken a kingdom that had forgotten its strength. And so, as spring broke across the land, the girl from Domremy, now armored, anointed, and no longer alone, rode out not just toward battle, but toward destiny. Because sometimes, it takes a stranger to remind a nation of who it truly is. Orléans was burning, not from fire, but from fear. For months, the English army had surrounded the city, choking it from the outside. Supply lines were cut. Morale had collapsed. The French defenders had begun to believe that God had abandoned them. Whispers of surrender floated like ash in the streets. But then came word, strange word, from Chinon. A girl is coming. She says she's sent by God. She says she will break the siege. They called her La Pucelle, the Maid. Joan of Arc. When Joan rode toward Orléans in April of 1429, she was dressed in shining white armor, seated upon a white horse. A banner, embroidered with images of Jesus, angels, and lilies, waved above her head. She was 17 years old. Thousands came to see her. Some came in awe. Some came in disbelief. But when she spoke, they listened. When she prayed, they followed. When she walked through the ranks, even the most hardened soldiers stood taller. She carried no weapon in battle, not a sword, but a banner. Yet she was more dangerous to the enemy than 100 men. Inside Orléans, her arrival was electric. The starving and the sick, those who had lost all hope, found something stirring again inside them. Confidence, faith, resistance. She inspected the walls. She questioned the commanders. She refused to sit in the background. "You must act," she told the generals. "The city will be saved, but not by waiting." And so she led them into battle. Over the next few days, Joan led multiple offensives against the English. She rode at the front, banner in hand, calling for courage, not blood. Arrows rained, cannons roared, and yet she pressed forward. At one point, Joan was wounded by an arrow pierced through the shoulder. She was pulled back behind the lines, bleeding and pale. But even in pain, she rose again. She bandaged herself. She prayed. And she returned to the battlefield, her face alight with purpose. Her presence was more than military. It was spiritual. It made soldiers believe that heaven itself marched with them. On May 8, 1429, the English forces, shaken, disorganized, and overwhelmed, lifted the siege and retreated. Orléans had been saved. The city bells rang for hours. People wept openly in the streets. French banners waved high above the towers again. And at the center of it all stood a teenage girl who had never seen war until weeks before. She had done what seasoned commanders could not. She had shattered fear and restored faith. She had become a living legend. From that moment forward, she was no longer just Joan. She was the Maid of Orléans. And the tide of the war had begun to turn. With Orléans liberated, the wind shifted in France's favor. But Joan of Arc had not come simply to win battles. She had a mission, clear, sacred, and unshakable. "He must be crowned," she said. "The Dauphin must take his place, not in name, but in truth." The throne of France had long been tarnished, shadowed by betrayal, division, and doubt. Charles VII, timid, uncertain, and hesitant, had never been officially crowned. The cathedral at Reims, where kings had been anointed for centuries, was deep in enemy territory. The journey would be dangerous, perhaps suicidal. But Joan did not hesitate. She turned to the king and said, "In God's name, let us go to Reims." And something remarkable happened. He listened. What followed was not just a military campaign. It was a pilgrimage, a procession of faith and fire. From town to town, village to village, Joan rode at the front. Banner held high, armor gleaming in the summer sun. And one by one, the cities opened their gates. Not with resistance, but with joy. Not with swords, but with songs. People rushed to the roads to see her. They shouted, "Vive Jeanne!" They threw flowers beneath the hooves of her horse. Even hardened warlords laid down arms and pledged allegiance. They had come to believe what she always had, that her mission was not of this world alone. As they approached Reims, the English and their allies made no move to stop her. Some fled, others watched in disbelief. Because Joan, this untrained, unarmed girl, was doing the impossible. She was uniting a kingdom long thought broken. On July 17, 1429, the people of Reims crowded into the great cathedral. The stained glass windows glowed like embers. The incense filled the air. And before the altar, surrounded by nobles, clergy, and commoners, Charles knelt to be crowned King of France. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner. Tears filled her eyes. And when the crown touched his head, she turned and whispered, "Now the will of heaven is fulfilled." She had restored the sacred thread of legitimacy. She had raised a nation to its feet, and she had done it not with nobility or birthright, but with faith, with fire, and with unshakable purpose. From that day forward, even kings bowed to her mission. But the days ahead would not remain filled with glory, for every rising sun casts longer shadows, and Joan's greatest trials were still to come. Victory crowned her, but in the glow of triumph came silence. After Rheims, Joan believed the fight was not yet over. She urged King Charles to march on Paris, to complete the liberation, to bring unity, finality, and peace. She was ready. Her soldiers were ready. Even the people were ready, but the king was not. Charles, newly crowned, grew cautious. He feared losing what he had just gained. He hesitated. He delayed. He listened not to Joan, but to advisors, diplomats, men in velvet robes and velvet minds. Joan, once the spark of the court, now found herself marginalized. She did not abandon her cause. While others grew comfortable, she remained in motion, fighting skirmishes, guarding towns, repelling attacks. But without royal support, her strength began to falter. Supplies ran low. Orders became slower. The soldiers grew weary. To many, the war had ended at Rheims. To Joan, the true war had only just begun. A war against apathy, against fear, against forgetting what had been paid for in blood. Then in the spring of 1430, while defending the town of Compiègne, Joan was captured. It was not by the English, but by their Burgundian allies, Frenchmen aligned with the enemy. She fought bravely, refusing to retreat, buying time for her men to escape. But she was surrounded, pulled from her horse, and taken prisoner. She had always feared one thing, not death, but being handed over to those who would never understand her mission. And that fear soon became reality. For a sum of money, the Burgundians sold Joan to the English. They would not fight her on the battlefield, but they would try to break her in court. In Rouen, behind thick stone walls, Joan of Arc was imprisoned, chained, isolated, deprived of the sacraments she loved. But the trial they prepared for her was no ordinary proceeding. It was a trial of faith, of politics, of fear. Over 16 interrogations, theologians and scholars pressed her. They asked about her visions, her voices, her clothing, her beliefs. They tried to twist her words, to trap her in contradiction, to prove she was not divine, but dangerous. But Joan held firm. In chains, in a cell, before her enemies, she spoke boldly, clearly, and without apology. If I am not in the grace of God, may He put me there, and if I am there, may He keep me. They accused her of heresy, of sorcery, of dressing like a man, but what they truly feared was something much simpler: her truth, her unshakable belief that one soul could move a kingdom. And yet, the hours grew long, the questions relentless. Her health declined. Her spirit, though mighty, was tested. She was alone, not on the battlefield, but on the spiritual front line. The fire had not yet come, but the shadows were closing in. It was dawn. Rouen sky was gray, the streets quiet. And in the prison below the castle, Joan of Arc prepared for her final morning. She had been tried. She had been condemned. And now she would be burned alive. But not because she had killed, not because she had lied, not even because she had led an army. She was sentenced because she had heard a voice, because she wore armor, because she dared to follow conviction in a world ruled by crowns and fear. The judges declared her a heretic. They claimed she had blasphemed by wearing men's clothing. They said her visions were tricks of the devil. They demanded she recant or die. At one moment, weakened by exhaustion and fear, she signed a confession, begging for the sacrament, pleading for mercy. But later, regaining her strength, she withdrew her words, declaring, "It was not from myself that I came. I did not invent the mission. I was sent." They had tried to break her soul, but in the end, it was her flame that remained unbroken. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led to the marketplace of Rouen. Crowds gathered, some in silence, some jeering, some in tears. A tall wooden stake rose in the center. Torches crackled nearby. She wore a simple white robe. Her hands were bound, and her eyes were steady. A priest offered her a crucifix. She kissed it. She wept, but she did not beg. "I am not afraid," she whispered, "for I was born for this." They lit the fire, and as the flames rose, so too did her voice. Through the smoke, she cried the name of Christ, again and again, until the wind carried it no more. Some say the flames refused to touch her face. Some say a dove flew from the pyre. Others say only silence followed. But all agreed on one thing. The girl who died that day died with dignity, with faith, and with fire in her soul. They burned her body. They scattered her ashes in the river Seine. They thought they had erased her. But you cannot burn conviction. You cannot drown courage. And you cannot silence a voice that speaks truth. Joan was gone, but her story was just beginning. The flames had gone cold. Her body turned to ash. The crowd dispersed, but Joan of Arc did not vanish. Her voice lingered, in whispers, in tears, in prayers, across villages, across kingdoms, across time. Though the English had hoped to silence her, they had unknowingly made her eternal. What they burned was not a heretic, but a symbol, a light, a legend. In the years that followed her death, France remembered. The very people who once doubted her now spoke of her with reverence. Soldiers who had fought beside her wept at the memory of her courage. Villagers who had seen her ride past told their children, "I saw her with my own eyes. She was real." And the king she had crowned, Charles VII, remained on the throne. Secure, victorious, because of her. But he remained silent about her death. He said nothing. He did not save her. And perhaps that silence haunted him. 20 years later, as France began to heal, something remarkable happened. A movement rose, not of rebellion, but of vindication. The people demanded to know the truth. Was Joan truly a heretic? Or had she been sacrificed by politics and fear? In 1456, Charles VII, now older, wiser, finally ordered an official retrial, a nullification trial, a chance to set history straight. Dozens of witnesses were called. Soldiers, priests, judges, citizens all spoke of her goodness, her clarity, her faith, her mission. And the verdict? Clear and loud. Joan of Arc was declared innocent. Her original trial, a sham. Her execution, a murder. She was cleared of all charges, not just by a court, but by history itself. And though she was long gone in body, the world now began to see her not as a peasant, not as a soldier, but as something far greater. A martyr, a hero, a saint in the making. Her voice, once doubted, was now unshakable. Her cause, once feared, now sanctified. And her memory, once buried, now rose like firelight across the world. Joan of Arc died without a title. No crown, no sanctuary, no reward. And yet, centuries later, her name would be whispered in churches, carved into marble, and invoked by kings and revolutionaries alike. France did not forget. The very land she had once bled for would come to see her not just as a savior, but as its soul. By the 16th century, as France endured new wars and religious turmoil, Joan's memory became a rallying cry. She was invoked not for conquest, but for unity. Not for blood, but for identity. Artists painted her, poets sang of her, statues rose in her likeness, sword raised, eyes lifted heavenward. And everywhere, she was called by one name, the Maid of Orleans. In the 19th century, as France struggled to redefine itself after revolution and empire, her image burned brighter than ever. To the monarchists, she was the defender of divine right. To the republicans, she was the voice of the people. To the faithful, she was a chosen soul. To the nation, she was hope. But still, for all the honor poured upon her memory, she had not yet received the one title her life truly earned: sainthood. It would take nearly 500 years, but in 1909, the Church officially beatified Joan of Arc. And in 1920, she was canonized as Saint Joan of Arc, one of the most revered figures in Catholic history. The little girl from Domremy, who once feared she was not worthy, was now declared a saint before the world. In Paris, thousands gathered to celebrate. Bells rang across cathedrals, candles flickered in rural churches, veterans saluted, children sang, and once again, France remembered who she was. But sainthood did not place Joan on a pedestal above the people. It did something more powerful. It brought her closer. She was now a saint, not because she had been perfect, but because she had been human, and yet had still dared to listen to something greater, to faith, to conscience, to the whisper of purpose that so few have the courage to obey. Today, her face appears on stained glass and stamps. Her story is told in dozens of languages. And her name still carries weight, because Saint Joan of Arc was not made by the Church, nor by kings, nor even by history itself. She was made by her conviction, and she became the heartbeat of a nation. A nation born again every time someone dares to believe in something greater than fear. Though Joan of Arc lived and died in France, her legacy belongs to the world. Across continents and centuries, her story has pierced through borders, languages, and belief systems. Because what she stood for, courage, conviction, sacrifice, faith, is not French alone. It is human, universal, timeless. In the United States, she is honored with statues and churches. In Canada, schools bear her name. In Japan, her life is taught as an example of honor and duty. In Africa, her story has inspired female resistance leaders. In literature, she appears in Shakespeare's plays, Schiller's tragedies, Twain's tributes. In music and opera, in film and even video games, her spirit rises again and again. Joan has become a mirror. Each generation looks at her and sees its struggle, its fight, its questions, its hope. For women seeking to break barriers, she is a pioneer. For the faithful, she is a symbol of divine courage. For the oppressed, she is a beacon of rebellion with purpose. And for those on the edge of fear, she is a whisper that says, "You do not need permission to be brave." Joan never wrote a book, never ruled a nation, never lived past the age of 19. And yet, her legacy has outlived kings and conquerors. She has inspired revolutions, guided movements, and transformed silence into strength. Because when a single soul dares to stand firm in the storm, even history itself listens. Joan's story ends in fire, but her meaning begins in what survives that fire. Every time we stand for something we believe in, every time we choose truth over safety, every time we listen to the quiet voice within, we keep her spirit alive. She is not only the saint of France, She is the saint of every soul who was told you can't, and answered with "Watch me." Joan of Arc reminds us that greatness does not come from power. It comes from purpose. That even in the hands of the overlooked, the young, the unheard, the divine can move. She showed the world that courage is not the absence of fear. It's action in spite of it. That faith is not something you speak. It's something you walk into the fire with. And maybe, just maybe, we don't need a crown to lead. We don't need an army to change the world. We only need a reason, a voice, a flame. Just like her, she was a daughter, a warrior, a martyr, saint. But above all, Joan of Arc was human, and in her humanity, she found eternity. Joan of Arc's story is not just history, it is a reminder. A reminder that one voice, no matter how small, can echo louder than any army. That one conscience, no matter how questioned, can withstand the fire. She lived only 19 years. She held no political power. She led with no fear. And she died with no regret. But centuries later, when the world looks for courage, when nations feel lost, when hearts search for meaning, it is her name we still remember. Her footsteps have faded. Her armor has rusted. But her flame still burns. Not in stone, not in stories, but in us. In anyone who dares to believe that faith can move nations, that integrity can defy kings, and that even in the darkest hour, light can rise. This was the story of Joan of Arc. May her courage awaken our own.